Hello, my name is Ann Conable. I'm one of the members of the Buffalo History Museum Board of Managers, and I'm delighted to introduce to you the exhibit, Emblem of Equality. This exhibit was put together to celebrate the centennial of the coming of women's suffrage in the United States. And this has been a wonderful exhibit talking about what was happening in Western New York during this period of very important social ferment that was occurring. My own story connects up with this story in a kind of an interesting way. My great-grandmother lived in Warsaw, New York. Her name was Margaret Strawn Gownlock. She unfortunately died early and died before women's suffrage became a major force in the United States. However, she was very interested in education for young women. All of her daughters, and she had several, were encouraged to go to college, and they did. And she also was very involved in Warsaw in Wyoming County as part of social activism of that period. She wanted very badly for women to have the vote, but she was before her time in terms of it actually coming to pass. On the other end of the story in my own life is my mother. Her name was Charlotte Williams Conable. She was born and raised here in Buffalo, and she lived in a very different time when the women's rights campaigns of the 1970s and 80s was going on. She, after her children were grown, went back to school to get a master's degree in women's studies and wrote a book that now is used across the country in women's studies programs about her experience as a female student at Cornell University. So these two women have been very inspirational in my life because of their interest in championing women's rights, and that directly connected me to this exhibit when the History Museum was putting it together. In 1853, young Harriet Townsend, who would have a distinguished future as founder of the Women's Educational and Industrial Union, was 14 years old. Her father insisted that she and her sister attend the first lecture in Buffalo by Susan B. Anthony and Antoinette Brown. They spoke on temperance and women's rights. Harriet recalled, "The stage was entirely bare of decorations. A pine table and two wooden chairs were its only furniture. The young women speaking were dressed in black gowns, relieved by white cuffs and collars. There was no one to welcome or introduce them. They did their part nobly. The message was like a bugle call for followers. Little applause greeted them, but all who heard were respectful and made to think." In 1861, the reception was different. Susan B. Anthony spoke with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and George Francis Train on abolition and women's rights to 175 at St. James Hall. By the way, here in the exhibit, here is what St. James Hall looked like. It was downtown where today's M&T Plaza is located. It was a major civic center during the 19th century here in Buffalo. The Buffalo Courier called Stanton a tragedian who proceeded to inform those present of the horrible state of things which now and always had existed in the world generally, and in this country particularly. The audience interrupted continuously and prevented the speakers from continuing. Someone shut off the gas, leaving the audience in total darkness. What a mess. They were back in 1867, again at St. James Hall, addressing a better audience and receiving kind reviews from the Buffalo Express. The newspaper said of Anthony, "She speaks right on." More generous praise was given to Stanton. "She is undoubtedly the most impressive advocate of women's suffrage, now engaged in agitations of that question." By 1887, the seeds planted by Anthony's tireless visits grew into suffrage clubs across Western New York. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the founders of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. Traveling around the state leaders prompted the formation of women's political clubs under several labels, most commonly political equality clubs. These clubs generated membership by fosing on local issues of concern to residents and also women's suffrage. By 1900, 31 clubs were functioning in Western New York. Anna Osborne Williams, president of the Buffalo Political Equality Club, said that the early meetings were held at her home, and sometimes as few as 3 serious, earnest women attended. I'd like to mention here, while we're stopped right here, that this lady, Ella Hawley Crossett, was a very good friend of my great-grandmother's, who I mentioned earlier in this taping. Ella was the founder and president of the Wyoming County Political Equality Club, based in Warsaw, New York. She and my great-grandmother became very good friends, and because they were very good friends and had worked together on women's education and issues of women's rights, my great-grandmother was able to meet, through Ella, Susan B. Anthony on one of her many trips through Western New York. My grandmother was a little girl at the time, and she used to tell us the story of when Susan B. Anthony came to dinner at their home, which must have been an amazing, incredible opportunity. But my grandmother's remembrance of Susan B. Anthony, because she was a little girl, as you might expect, had to do with the fact that she was quite offended that Susan B. Anthony had very large feet, and she ate all the olives that were in the dish on the table during the course of the dinner. I think my grandmother had a thing for olives. She still did as an adult when I remembered her. So these ladies all had everything to do with organizing the various clubs in Western New York. But the 1901 Pan American Exposition brought several state and national women's rights conventions to Buffalo, bringing valuable publicity to local suffrage organizations. In 1902, the New York State Women's Suffrage Association annual convention was held in Buffalo in the parlors of the Church of the Messiah on North and Mariner Streets. Buffalo's mayor gave a welcome speech. Susan B. Anthony and the Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, spoke. Buffalo suffragists organized 2 suffrage parades, the first on Flag Day, June 14, 1913, and again a year later on June 6, 1914. Their purpose was to generate publicity so that they could positively influence men to vote for suffrage in the scheduled 1915 state referendum. In 1913, the festive atmosphere of the city, festooned with American flags, contributed to the cheerful crowds that watched the 1,000 women march from Niagara Square through downtown streets and up Main Street. They wore white with white hats and yellow sashes. The Buffalo Times estimated the crowd watching at 250,000. The 1914 parade also introduced new colors. Blue was featured as part of the Empire State Campaign for the 1915 referendum. And for the first time, the green, purple, and white of the Women's Political Union were seen in the parade. That group would evolve into the National Women's Party and gain notoriety by picketing the White House in 1917. An opposing anti-suffrage movement took place as well. Buffalo anti-suffragist Mary B. Utley said, "A vote is a poor thing in itself. Let women be content to leave with men the burden of politics, performing well her share of the world's work, which is unlimited in scope and a sufficient burden." Buffalo's antis organized in 1900. They did not make street corner speeches or hold rallies, but preferred to speak at local organizations and lobby in Albany. New York State's association opposed to women's suffrage was successful in delaying statewide approval of women's suffrage. But after 1915, their cause lost ground because suffrage organizations grew significantly in membership, which enabled them to reach into every county and village with speakers and pamphlets. Anti-suffrage themes were consistent. Women's suffrage was a socialist tactic. Women's suffrage was the gateway to feminist extremism. Legal protections for women would be invalidated. Extending suffrage to women would increase the number of ignorant voters. In 1915, a Buffalo suffrage leader stated to the New York Times that the anti-movement has never got off Delaware Avenue. The Buffalo Courier observed that during the 1913 Buffalo suffrage parade, the anti-suffragists came out in their limousines to gaze at the sight. Less than 2 weeks before the scheduled New York State referendum on suffrage, President Woodrow Wilson endorsed the vote. He praised women for their war work, ending thus, I therefore am very glad to add my voice to those which are urging the people of the great state of New York to set a great example by voting for women's suffrage. Dorothy Thompson said on November 6, 1917, the day before the referendum vote, "With Woodrow Wilson's splendid message fresh in the minds of the people, and with leaders in every line of thought rallying to our support, I believe we are going to win." Early in the evening of November 7, 1917, anti-suffrage leaders were observed closing their office on Main Street in Buffalo. The suffragists partied in their Brisbane offices late into the evening. The vote for women in New York was accomplished. This part of the exhibit talks about a part of the story that I really didn't know a lot about, and that is there were a number of Buffalo women who were very involved in the movement for women's suffrage and who were willing to go to jail for it. One of the things that happened during this period that had never happened before was the leaders of the women's suffrage movement nationally began to picket at the White House. This was unheard of. And so a number of involved women from Buffalo were part of that picketing. And generally speaking, they were breaking the law. So a number of them were willing to go to jail for this cause. You may be aware in the story of the suffrage movement internationally, particularly in Britain, that the picketers and protesters there for women's suffrage had been handled very badly. They were force-fed, they were in jail for long periods of time. Really pretty brutal stories. You may be familiar with some of those stories. These folks were not subjected to some of that same brutal treatment, but they certainly, in some cases, went to jail, and they, as I said, they were willing to do that. So these ladies are really kind of our heroines of the story, that they were willing to put their thoughts and sentiments out there on the line, and were willing to sacrifice their jobs, their reputations, to go to jail because they believe so strongly in the movement. Congress passed the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution on June 4, 1919. It said simply, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." The amendment was then sent to the 48 states for ratification. The approval of legislatures of 37 states was required for the amendment to be fully ratified. This occurred on August 18, 1920, when Tennessee became the 38th state to approve it. This closes our exhibit tour. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you've maybe learned something in the process. We are very proud to have presented this exhibit at the Buffalo History Museum, and we hope you'll come by and see what we have next on tap for your edification. Thank you.